So without further ado, I'll introduce our guest this evening, and he'll tell us more about the event.
Hello, good evening. Sorry that we're starting late. My name is I'm the Secretary of the Bricklet Circle. And about a couple of months ago, Catherine and a colleague Shahira, they contacted us and they wanted to explore whether we can work with them to run some seminars during this Bengal Heritage Month. And this is the first one, isn't it? Bengal First Heritage Month. And so they've been organizing something nearly every day. And they had a launch of the exhibition, and lots of people came. And we were very pleased, to help organize 2 seminars for them. And just say very quickly a few words about Bricklet Circle. In the Bricklet Circle, we have been organizing seminars and conferences and many other things for several years now. And our main aim is to try and create conditions in a way, because the Bangladeshi community is sometimes divided. One group doesn't want to meet another group, and they will see in their own group and invent things of other group and so on. So we try to create conditions where people from all types of background can come and look at things and in an objective way and use evidence and logic and research-based information to engage with each other. And so we have been very lucky to be able to continue to attract people like them. So thank you very much. I'll just say a little bit about them and the 2 people we have. Then I will pass on to them, and then they will make a presentation and so on. So the talk is before Tagore, music, farce and Muslim patterns in the 19th century Bengal, by Richard David Williams and Priyanka Basu. Priyanka Basu is an MPhil PhD student at the Department of Languages and Cultures in South Asia Service. Her research is entitled Cockfight in Tune, Reading Nations, Communities and Performances in the Bengali Kobigaan. And Richard is an MPhil PhD student at the Department of Music and a member of the Indian Institute at King's College. He was previously awarded BA in Theology and then MPhil in Modern South Asian Studies at the University of Oxford. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you also to Catherine and Hamlet for inviting us here. It's a really great honour to be part of Bengal Heritage Month. So basically, Priyanka and I are both working on music in 19th century Bengal and specifically Calcutta, but we are approaching it quite differently, and our work has quite different priorities. So we thought it would be quite nice this evening to try and pull together some of the ideas that we've been dealing with in our work and try and flag up some ideas about the 19th century and what's happening in music then, because it is a period that is often quite overlooked, when in fact it was actually a period of massive change and all kinds of interesting developments. Just as a little warning, we're not going to try and cover everything that was happening in music in 19th century Bengal, because it would just be too sweeping. So instead, each of us are going to talk about a couple of things that we found which are really interesting and actually quite important when you're trying to understand what was going on in society as well as in the art scene in general. So we can start with Priyanka, and then I'm going to take over, and then after that we'll open up the discussion. So if you could leave any questions till the end, that'd be great. So.
So, today's talk is somewhere between my MPhil research and my ongoing PhD research, and I am been looking quite a bit at the indigenous music scenario in 19th century Calcutta. So now when I'm talking about Bengal here, if you see this map, this is what I mean by Bengal, a comprehensive Bengal, non-partition. So this was Bengal in 19th century. So when we talk about the Renaissance in the early 19th century Calcutta, there are certain names which come up to us, and those are names like Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Tagore, So these are the very prominent common names. Raman Roy spearheaded the Brahmo movement. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, he did a lot for the widow remarriage and the spread of education. So there were a lot of social movements happening during the 19th century in Calcutta. But when we view the history in this way, it's a very linear fashion of viewing the history. We are only taking certain key figures and we are not taking into account what was happening in the lower orders of the city. Because it was during this time that there was a great influx from the rural areas into the slowly urbanizing city space of Calcutta. So this was a time when the Muslim rule, 700 years of Muslim rule in India was in a turmoil. And it was a time when absentee zamindars, absentee feudal lords had started coming up. So they had their tax collectors and they had their people in the villages who would oppress the farmers, while zamindars themselves would live in the city, and the city was Calcutta. So in such a social-political turmoil, the people would come into the city in search of jobs. So who were these people? Before that, let's have a look at this poem. It's a huge epic poem. I've taken some lines from it. It's by the poet called Mukundaram Chakraborty, and this is a poem from medieval Bengal. So if you can see, there are certain place names: Chitrapur, Shalikha, Kolkata, Betor, Dhanata, Hijuli and Kalighat. So if you see within this, these are all small villages, and within it, Calcutta was also a well-grown village. So in medieval Bengal, it was still a small, well-grown village, but by the beginning of the 19th century, with the coming in of colonization, it started slowly getting urbanized, and it attracted a lot of people from the villages who were they were farmers, they were fishermen, they were sweet makers, washermen, gardeners, tailors, who kept on coming into the city. And Kolkata started being mapped according to the class composition of these people. So there would be a black town, there would be a white town, there would be something very similar to Grub Street here in London. So we had an area called Bortala that would house the hack writers. And there would be red light areas, fishermen colonies. So all of them had slowly started coming into the city. And who would employ them? They would be obviously the English, then the Danish, Armenians, French and Portuguese. So, and how would they be employed? They would get positions of peons, servants, watchmen, postmen, clerks, coachmen, and many such other positions. So when these people were coming into the city, what they were bringing with them was their own rural cultural environment, which was so far a very religious form of cultural entertainment. So when they were coming into the city, their entertainment forms also got imported to the city itself. But it could not be continued in that religious format, because a patron in the city was a new kind of a patron. He was not the feudal lord or patron of the village. His taste has changed by now with the urbanization. So these forms of entertainment had to suit the patron's taste, first of all, and then the common audience. And the performance space for these genres would be during the festivities, the pujas, the ritual, Holi, Durga Puja. These would be the festive spaces when these performers would gather at the house of the patron and perform. So, the first genre of performance that I'm going to talk about, and this is what I'm researching on in my PhD, is called Kobigaan. So if you can see, Kobigaan is comprised of two words. One is Kobi, which is it's a Bengali word. So Kobi means poet and Gaan is song. So this is a form in verse dwelling, or it's a musical contest. You have two separate poet groups and they begin with an invocation and slowly they start fighting a musical duel. So one group would question and the other would answer back, and they would go on, and finally the person who would win would be rewarded by the patron. So that was in a gist what Kobigaan was. And Kobigaan was a conglomeration of a lot of other art forms which were prevalent in the rural areas. So within its structure, it was sometimes incorporating these forms, sometimes taking them out according to the wish or according to the taste of the patron. So it was more of a public demand. So it was not religious in the sense that it used to be. So it was more a kind of suiting itself to the popular taste of the patron and the city audience. And historians have marked the flourishing period of the Kobiwalas between 1760 and 1830. But this question-answer format within a poem, or the contest, it dates back to much before than this time period. So we cannot actually bind it within this time period. So the question-answer format has been there in poetry for a long time. So who were these poet singers? They were part of these villagers who had come into the city in search of jobs. So on the one hand, they were working in the city, and singing or performing was their other side profession. So to give you a better sense of what I am talking about, I'll show you a video of the Kobigaan. And here is, this person is, I'm sorry I don't have subtitles for this, I'm just going to give you a gist of what he's singing. This is a person who has heard a long time back, he has seen a Kobigaan performance and he's mesmerized by his own favorite performer, and he's narrating that yes, he was so aggressive and he just swept away the opponent at one blow. And the content of these question answers, or the content of the Kobigaan performance, would be overtly comic. So you were attacking the opponent in a very comic, satiric way. And whether the person would win or lose would depend on how far, how strongly he could retain the comic essence and the audience attention. So here in this performance, the Kobiwala, he's a poet singer, is trying to tell his opponent that you do not need to butter up the patron if you perform well, because the opponent has been trying to praise a patron by likening him to a kind of god and having an aura around him. So it's like we are both fighting the musical duel for money. So we don't have any other motive other than economic gains. So you do not need to praise him, just fight the musical battle. So that's just what he tries telling the opponent. Just notice how he is attacking him. I mean, they're singing and also they have a bodily gesture. So the comic is both a part of the language in the song as well as how they are mimicking the opponent in the bodily gesture. So he's the opponent who's sitting quietly because he's already praised the patron and now he's being attacked by the other poet singer. And as you can see, this is a chorus which would be part of the performance repertoire. So this was, this is from a 1967 film called Anthony Philippi. So in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of films on these poet performers, poet singers was coming up in the Bengali film industry. So I've taken this bit from that film just to give you a sense of what it was like. It might not be an authentic representation, but it would give you some idea of what it was. So, and Anthony Ferengi was one of the popular poet singers. He was not a Bengali. He had a Bengali mother and a Portuguese father. But he got interested in the performance form, and he learned it. And the person you saw in this video who was singing, he wanted to learn from him. His name was Bhola Moira. Bhola was his name, and Moira in Bengali, it means a person who makes sweeps. So as you can see, they had one profession, and they were performers as well. And many a times they would be known by their name and the profession to which they would belong. There was one person who was called Keshta Muchi. Keshta is a name and Muchi is a cobbler. So you would have the name and instead of the surname, the profession of the person. So Anthony, this is a whole film on Anthony Ferengi and how he came into this performance and how he continued it and all that. So I'd like to show you one more video where you see Anthony Ferengi and Bhola Moira, from whom he wanted to learn. They are fighting a musical duel. And here, this person, Bhola Moira, he's attacking him on the grounds of his religion. He's like, you're a Christian, how can you come into this, how can you perform the Kobi songs? Because it is all Hindu in content. Kobigaan is a very Hindu content. Muslims were not performing Kobigaan. So he's like, we can't have you within this performance repertoire, you're not part of us. So he's attacking his opponent, who's Anthony Ferengi. It's like they've taken up loads of professions, like someone is a barrister, someone is a magistrate. Why have you come here to fight musical duels? Don't you have other work? Because you are not part of us. So, philippi is a very derivative word. It's used for those people who were born out of, who had a Portuguese or a French or an English parent, and on the other hand, a Bengali mother. So, mostly they would have a Portuguese or French or English father and a Bengali mother. So it was in a sense used as a derogatory term for these people. So mainly the content of these songs would be very comic, and it would depend on how far you could retain the comic essence. So as you can see, since because the comic was the main essence of the performance, they could not stick to something which was very serene or religious in the rural setup, or pure, so to say. So these were constantly being attacked on grounds of vulgarity and obscenity. So there were attacks from the English missionaries, there were attacks from the English educated nouveau riche in the city, who would look down upon these forms. So they would say that this cannot be the part of a tradition which we are trying to uphold. They cannot be part of our rich history. So when we talk about the Renaissance Bengal, we generally liken it to a kind of golden age. So this can't be part of a golden age. It has to have like colossal figures. So there were attacks on it from different corners. There were attacks from the missionaries, there were attacks from the English educated gentlemen, but a section of the gentlemen was also trying to retain its essence. So Kobigaan as a performance was in a topsy-turvy in between all these reactions. So that was Kobigaan. And next, I come to another form which is called the shawn. So, what is shawn in English would roughly mean pantomime. So, it was also kind of mimicry. And the shawn performances would also happen during the festivities. And there was a specific festival called the Choruk, which was devoted to the cult of the god Shiva. And during that time, there would be fair spaces, and these shawns would perform in the fair space, and there would be acts of body piercing. So even that was finally banned by the colonial government. They said that you cannot continue all these so-called monstrosities because it is against the official law that we are trying to impose onto the colonial city space. So there is a clash between the indigenous population, who was not the English educated, the lower orders, so-called lower orders. There was a clash between them and the colonial official order because they had their own sense of time. It was an official time and there would be sounds of the cannons from Fort William. Fort William was one of the seat of the government. So there would be there would be markers of the official time. And on the other hand, you will have this population of the indigenous people who were given to the comic, mirth, merrymaking after the day's work. They would gather and have fun amongst themselves. So there was a clash amongst them. So this is a picture from a Bengali monthly called washroom. Washroom in Sanskrit refers to a clownish figure. So the Bengali monthly was called washroom. And as you can see, there are women and there's a crowd which is gathered in a fair space or a festive space, and you can see a figure which is very Sahib or English, wearing a coat and a pant. This is actually a shawn. He is a pantomime actor, and the crowd is talking amongst itself. They're like, what is this? I mean, what is the person? I mean, what is the impersonation? And one of them is saying that this must be a Sahib from Calcutta. So this was also a reason why the colonial official order was trying to suppress these performances because they were being mocked. Within this comic spree, the performers were not sparing anybody. I mean, satire doesn't choose or differentiate between the official order or the lower order. They would make fun of anything or everything, the social, cultural, political incidents that were taking place within the city. And then there's this newspaper report on 20th December 1823 that shows how these shawns would also be called if there was a gathering in a house of a rich gentleman. So if you can see towards the end, it's saying this was also followed by the Bhans. Bhans were comic figures like the shawns, performing different shawn performances, though some of them who were dressed as cows masticated grass. So again, a bodily act, which is kind of trying to violate or subvert the official colonial order, so mocking them. So the missionaries, and one of them, the Baptist missionary W. Ward, he saw such performances and the musical performances, one of which was Kobigaan, he saw them as obscene. And he said, the songs of the Hindus sung at religious festivals and even by individuals on boats and in the streets are intolerably offensive to a modest person. So, ban them. So, and there's one more account. It's Banerjee. He is one of the writers on 19th century Calcutta and its elite and popular cultures. This is from his one of his most famous books, The Parlor in the Streets. And he talks about a shawn who is engaging in a bodily act on the streets and how he is taken into police custody and he is subjected to a fine of 50 rupees because he's not allowed to impersonify the colonial official in this way. As you go through the code, you will find how he is kind of subverting the office of the colonial government. So, the strong performances in the city, they were confined to some specific areas. One of them was a colony of the fishermen, which is Jelipara, and the colony of the braziers, Kasharipara. So, they would work with brass, metal brass. And even if the Babu or the gentleman, he was kind of these performances should be sidelined and we should not be incorporating them within the official culture of the city, they would have an underlying interest of watching these performances. So if you see another picture from Washroom, you can see two men below, and one of them has covered himself up because he wants to go for a shawn performance. He's a gentleman. So he is disguising in order to go for a shawn performance because he can't just go and walk into a performance space of the shawn. Because he's a gentleman, he is not allowed to see such. He should not be watching such obscene performances. Another picture, this is also from Washroom, it shows how women were very interested in these kind of performances. And there's this woman who was expressing her interest to her husband that I want to go for a shawn performance, and how she's being confined within the house because you are not allowed. Because you're a woman, all the more, you are not allowed to go for these shawn performances. So what happened in the process? There were voices against Kobigaan and the indigenous performances. So, if you read it towards the end, they're saying, houses of some of the Babus of Calcutta are annually the scene of these disgraceful exhibitions. Others have got heartily tired of them and have substituted the less barbarous but not less immortal notches by the biggies, which Richard would talk about in more detail. But the kavi as in Kobi, poet, are in high repute in the Mufassil, and women from behind the screens may be observed greedily devouring their licentious effusions. So this is from the Calcutta Review, which is a comment from the official order. And there were voices for Kobigaan and the indigenous performances. They're saying, despite this, if our young Bengal Babus, young Bengal was the very English educated radical section of youth in 19th century Calcutta. Despite this, if our young Bengal Babus take pleasure in calling them tuneless, they were saying that it's just a play of, they just bang on their percussions and cymbals and they do not produce music. So these were not considered as music at all. So if they have pleasure in calling them tuneless and rhythmless, it is rather harmless to turn a deaf ear to such comments. So, again, within such reactions, what happened? Kobigaan started Kobigaan and also these shawn performances, they slowly started losing their patrons in the city. So they would not have patrons because by now, by the mid-19th century, the gentlemen were looking for a more non-vulgar, more pure kind of entertainment, and they had developed their interest in the proscenium theatre, very English-influenced proscenium theatre. So they wanted a theatre of their own, and that would be a marker, a symbol for their kind of nationalism. The Bengalis, their sense of nationalism was also a kind of adjustment with their allegiance to the colonial government. So they thought that for us, the perfect kind of entertainment would be the proscenium stage. So we do not need these entertainments anymore. We would have a theatre of our own. So what happened in the process, these performances, they faced a lack of patrons as well as a lack of audience, because the audience was also now guided towards the theatre proper. So what happened, they started slowly shifting out from the center, which is Calcutta. They started shifting out from the colonial center. So when they shifted out, in the western areas, they would shift to places like Hooghly, Howrah, Medinipur and Bankura. This is the map showing those places. You can see Hooghly, Howrah and all those places, which were towards the west of Calcutta. And they would also move towards the east of Calcutta to places like Dhaka, Mymensingh, Rajshahi and Joshua. So in the process, Eastern Bengal started developing its own kind of Kobigaan. So till now, the dominant performance was from Calcutta. So that was the one kind of Kobigaan or performance that was happening. Now, the patrons, if you can see, interestingly, the performance is again moving back to its rural roots. So again, there's a shift of taste, and they have started finding out new patrons in Eastern Bengal. So if we look at Eastern Bengal, we have three strands of Kobigaan performances, three kinds. One that was directly influenced by the Kobigaan performance in Calcutta. So they have been trained in that tradition. Two, there were places in Eastern Bengal like Dhaka and Mymensingh that had its own separate variety of Kobigaan performance. So they developed this new repertoire of performance. And thirdly, and this is the most interesting one, was from a place called Tagore in Bangladesh, which slowly started, and this is towards early 20th century. They slowly started shedding the religious skin. They said that we won't have the very Hindu Kobigaan, but they started getting leftist sentiments into the performance. So, what was the subject of this new form of Kobigaan? They would talk about the difference between a farmer and a middleman, a laborer and a mill owner, the rich and the poor, capitalists and the communists. So since the form is already out of its religious fervor, it's easy to get more social themes incorporated in the performance itself. So this was a strand of Kobigaan which had later influenced the Indian People's Theatre movement. The Indian People's Theatre Association, all those protest songs which would come up in the beginning of the leftist movement in West Bengal and Bangladesh. And the final shifting, so this was the geographical shuffling of the performance form. So this was the second phase. The first phase was 19th century Calcutta, Kolkata, coming in of people from village to the city, again moving out of city into the rural spaces, and there was the third major geographical reshuffling, and that came with the partition. So during the partition, a majority of the Hindu performers, most of them moved into West Bengal. those of who were retained were the Muslim performers. They were retained in Bangladesh. So, this is the research which I have to take up from June because I'm going for my field work and I do not have much idea about the performances now. But interestingly, they have again these performances, Kobigaan performances in Bangladesh after partition and after the formation of Bangladesh from East Pakistan. So they have become very Islamized in their content again because of their Bengali Islamic identity. So interestingly, the form, once it was Hindu, so it shed its religious skin and then now it's again become Muslim in its content. So in a nutshell, what I wanted to show was the course of the performance forms and how it traveled through 19th century to early 20th century to its current contemporary form in these two separate Bengals. And this is part of my research, my greater PhD research, which I'm still struggling with, and I hope to clarify my own questions and interests about this. Thank you.
Thank you. But before I move on to what I was going to talk about, I'd just like to say that if anyone is interested in any of the genres that we talk about today and what it sounds like in today's music, particularly kind of the folk genres and the kind of traditional music that you can get not just in cities but kind of across Bangladesh, across rural Bengal. There's an amazing website called the Travelling Archive, and it's run by a woman called Shawn, who's based in Calcutta, and she goes around all of the villages all across the countryside, and she is recording all of these traditional songs and putting them online for free. And so you can just listen to them, and she puts on the lyrics, she puts up the history behind each one. It's an amazing website. So that's the Travelling Archive. If you just Google that, you'll find it instantly. Some of the material that Priyanka is talking about is really resonant for what I want to say, but we do have a slightly different focus. So just by way of introduction to what I'm going to talk about, obviously today when you think about Calcutta and music, you think of it as being a real cultural hub and a place where during the winter it's just music festival after music festival after music festival, and that dimension of culture is really, really strong. But what's interesting is actually when you look back at the 19th century, as well as the materials that Priyanka is talking about, this kind of lower class culture, you also have all kinds of controversies that are happening at sort of, the more intellectual, the more musicological side of things. So for example, there was one character I'm looking at in my work called Banerjee, and he was from a long line of singers, and each teacher had given a student a specific form of high art music called knowledge, classical music, and he went on to become a great musicologist, and he tried to integrate Western forms of musical notation with Bengali music, and he was doing quite revolutionary things on a theoretical level. And in fact, he came to London in 1898 and he spoke on Indian music in the Royal Albert Hall, which in 1898 was, it was very ahead of its time. But what's interesting is when you look at his work, he came out with this quote which says, "No race is so unmusical as the Bengalis, or so disdainful of music," which is a bit of a shock, and you wouldn't really see that one coming. And so when I saw this, I thought, well, what is really going on here? Why is he saying that Bengalis don't like music? And I think there are quite a few things here which are worth discussing. So first of all, when he says unmusical, well, what does he mean by music? And obviously we've been talking about folk cultures of music and the things that they was bringing in, kind of popular street level music, and he was working with high art classical music. And so actually there's a whole spectrum of music going on in Calcutta. So when he says unmusical, what does he actually mean? And then he's saying that the Bengalis are disdainful of music. So one of the things I'm trying to do in my work is figure out something which you really brought to the fore here, about why was music socially controversial? And then another big question is, why is this man writing this stuff at all? Why is he saying that Bengalis aren't interested in music? Why is he writing things about Western musical notation? What's his motivation behind it all? And as you brought forward, actually, he was part of a much larger movement in Bengal, where you have English-educated Bengalis who are trying to justify the strengths and the merits of Bengali literature and Bengali social reform. And he's sort of representing the musical wing of it, where they're trying to say that Indian music, and specifically Bengali music, is something that we can be proud of, which is interesting. And so what I want to do today is put his ideas into context. Because the big thing is, 150 years ago, music in India was going through a massive change on every social level. And so you talk about the street level, and just to put this in context, because I work with kings in theory, and if I'm looking at kings who were moving around India 150 years ago. And one of the big things to think about is actually that high art, classical music, for centuries have been based in royal courts. And the idea there was that the king who paid for the music built himself up to be this amazing connoisseur of music, this expert, this kind of figurehead of culture. And so music always had this political dimension to it. But under colonialism, of course, all of those kings lose power, that whole political system changes. So what happens then? Where do the musicians go? And so when Priyanka was talking about these English-educated middle-class Bengalis who are trying to assert their idea of what the golden age of Bengali music should be, they're actually filling in that gap. So what they're doing is they're coming up with an idea of music that is modern and respectable, but at the same time isn't part of the court scene and isn't part of the street popular music either. So there are all of these things to think about when you're looking at Calcutta in this period. I'm going to approach it today by talking about three things. First of all, this issue of respectability. What is respectable music? And I'm going to use the example of women performers to kind of bring that out. I'm going to talk briefly about musicians on the move, as I like to call them, these figures who are going all across North India. And finally, I'm going to briefly mention alternative cultures that are happening in Bengal. So, first of all, respectability. Well, you've talked about Kobigaan, and I'm going to talk briefly about kirtan, which some of you may know it's still very prevalent today. It's a form of Hindu devotional music, and the idea is you assemble together in a group, you sing these hymns to God, and usually kirtans are associated with Krishna. And in the village cultures, they really kind of worked on the basis of celebrating episodes in the life of Krishna, and did have a very strong spiritual dimension. But then, just as Priyanka described, kirtan along with Kobigaan got brought from the villages into the city, and as the city culture developed, just like Kobigaan, kirtan also began to change. So what happened was they would continue using all of the religious language, but they were all given a twist and became a comment on what was happening in Calcutta in that period. So rather than going into much detail, I'll just give one example. There was one style of kirtan which was called Nauka Vilash, which is the pleasure of the boat ride. And the idea was you take the story of Krishna taking his consort Radha in a boat across the river Yamuna. And on the traditional village level, in the traditional kirtans, this would be a beautiful image of Krishna with his beloved. And what happens is the people who were singing the kirtans were critical about the bubbles and these kind of English-educated middle-class Bengalis, and they basically used this form to make fun of them. And there was, in a lot of the social commentaries and newspapers, you find references to these rich men taking girls out in the boats down the river in Calcutta. And basically when they have them trapped on the boat, they make them strip, they make them dance with them, they do all kinds of mischievous things. So what happens in the city versions of the kirtan is Krishna gets Radha on board his boat, and he's not on the Yamuna anymore, he's down by Hooghly. and he basically forces her to strip for him. And so what's happening is you have these quite traditional, respected forms of singing, and suddenly they're being subverted, they're being twisted to be more popular, but also a bit more scandalous. And the same kind of critiques that you were talking about that happened with Kobigaan was exactly the same with kirtan. A lot of people were saying, why are you taking these nice, pure religious forms and making them dirty? So there are all of these different things going on. So when we think about different kinds of song, it's not just a case of saying kirtan, you're actually talking about a whole different field of forms of kirtan. Some are respectable for the temple, and some are really, the kind of thing you'd sing out on the street, but only in front of certain people. And it was important to think about which kind of kirtan you'd want to sing, or what kind of songs you want to sing, particularly if you were a woman. So I'm going to talk about biggies and their tensions with other kinds of female performers in Calcutta. So who were the biggies? Well, throughout the 200 years ago, women were kind of at the centre of the transmission of musical knowledge, and you had various groups, and some of them in North India were called wife. And so they're very big in Bollywood now, and they're generally considered as courtesans, and they sing and they dance, and they're outside of marriage. And so the idea is that rather than being domestic, they would develop this musical knowledge and would have a patron. And so would have a relationship with the patron, who would then pay for the musical knowledge to continue. And you had an equivalent in Calcutta who became known as the biggies. And at the beginning of the 20th century, some of them went on to become recording artists. So when the gramophone companies and HMV first went to Calcutta, they needed to record singers for the first time. And who did they go to? They went to the biggies. And so they brought these women, some of whom had families who'd been in the red light districts for generations, and brought them forward and said, you know the best about singing, please sing on these recordings. And so some of them really became very famous. But what's important with them is when they were developing their kind of celebrity status, they were constantly trying to struggle with their roots in kind of this past, which now people are viewing as immoral. So it was a constant negotiation. So there was one woman in particular, well, two, who became very famous in the gramophones. One was called Kobigaan. If you type her in on YouTube, you'll find loads of her recordings. And her mother, Malkajan, was based in Calcutta, and then she moved back into kind of PUP, and she was actually Armenian, and she wrote poetry in Urdu, had it all published, and could sing and perform and dance. And so a really interesting group of women. And they're particularly interesting from my point of view in this period because morality was changing, like I said, and they were public women. And the idea of public women singing and dancing and performing was a very difficult thing for this period. In general, if you were a respectable woman, if you were married and you were part of a good household, the idea of singing in public was completely taboo. And this comes out in a quote from the Indian era in 1877 by the same guy who I quoted at the beginning. He said, "If a woman is heard to sing, from that moment she loses her respectability entirely. Singing and immorality are in the popular estimation most closely united." So actually when he was saying at the beginning, Bengalis don't like music, they're terrible at music, he's actually talking about things like this. He's saying Bengalis are very critical about music and critical about its performance. So there are a lot of things going on here. And one way that the biggies dealt with this was they distanced themselves from other kinds of women who were performing. Because the biggies in this period, a lot of whom were still living in the red light district, started saying, we don't dance, we don't do anything physical, we just sing, and we sing in beautiful Persian, we sing in beautiful Urdu, and that's it. Whereas next door would be a group of women called the Kamtawalis. And the Kamta was kind of traditional dance form that grew up in the villages and was again drawn into Calcutta. And it wasn't classical, it didn't require a lot of training, and a lot of the time it was basically an erotic dance. And so the biggies, their strategy was to say, we are not like them. Which is interesting because actually when you look at the biographies of these women, they were all living next door to each other, and a girl who had been brought up to practiced as Calcutta, she could train to start singing in Urdu and Persian and change her status. So what's interesting is music in this period was a way to change your social respectability, it was a way to change your income completely. And integral to all of this was the kind of singing you were doing, the kind of performance you were doing, whether you were doing dance, and what language you were singing in. Because all of the biggies who were there, even if they were Bengali, they were claiming that, no, we're not Bengali, we're not from the villages. We're descended from the great wife of Delhi and Lucknow, and so we only sing in Urdu. Whereas the Kemtawalis would only sing in Bengali. And so you've got all of these issues going on with these kind of performances. What's fascinating, I think, is what this all tells us about music in 150 years ago in Calcutta. It tells us, first of all, that genres weren't fixed in stone. There were new musical forms, like Priyanka was talking about how things were changing in the shawn, which suddenly became this form of criticism of the British. But you also have all these other traditional forms that are undergoing big changes. And then you also have to factor in this idea of the desire to reform society and the way that colonial morality, British morality, is trickling in and changing what kinds of performers are respectable, what kinds you could touch the barge pole, that kind of thing. And what's interesting in my work, I think, is tracing these women as they navigate all these controversies and criticisms. So basically what I'm saying is music was socially very messy, and it was best to be avoided if you want to keep the reputation intact, which is what I think essentially that first quote was talking about. So now I'm going to put this into a bigger perspective by talking about musicians on the move, because my work isn't just on Bengal, it's looking at movements between Lucknow and Calcutta. And what I found is that sort of 250 years ago, when the British were in India, some of them were really interested in Indian music, and you have references to British women going out there, and their husband would be an officer or something, and they'd start learning Persian and Urdu, and would start writing down all of the songs in the script, and you'd get secretaries who were Indian to write it for them, and they'd speak to these women, these biggies, etc., and write down all of their songs. And all of those texts are now here in libraries. And so what's fascinating is quite quickly that changed very dramatically. And so suddenly you have these musicians who can't go to the British, because the British aren't interested in Indian music anymore. There are lots of reasons for that. And they can't go to kings, because kings have lost their powers and their wealth, and so you can't go there. So what do? And a lot of them start moving and looking for different kinds of patron. But just to add an extra problem to it, the British colonial system at this period was imposing all kinds of new laws and new regulations. And one thing the British regime hated was movement, because it confused a lot of things. Which is difficult, because if you're a musician and you have to move across India looking for someone to pay you, and also if your caste is also quite a nomadic group by nature, then it becomes really problematic. So you have a lot of laws imposed saying nomadic tribes are criminal. And so you have these musicians who are forced to move, but they're being declared criminal just in their movement. I won't get into that, but feel free to ask about it later. But just to give you an example, because I have been a little vague about this, I'm looking at one family of instrumentalists who specialised in bar and sitar. And their origins can go all the way back to Delhi, and then they moved to Lucknow. And then after the fall of Lucknow in 1856, a group of them moved to Calcutta. And from there, one goes up to Nepal after a few years, and then another one goes back to Bihar, and then he dies, and his children go to Allahabad and Benares, and then one of them goes to Nepal. So what I'm saying is people are covering enormous distances, and we're talking about the 1860s, 1870s. And so their own personal journeys were huge. But what's fascinating is everywhere they went, they left students and they started teaching. And so what I'm saying is, in this period, as well as all of the local genres coming into cities and changing, what you actually have is all of the classically trained artists are spreading their expertise all around India because they're forced to move. And so that means you have a development of classical repertoires, which often we don't really take into account. We think of classical as kind of being this solid, unchanging thing, but actually it was going through its own journeys, literal journeys in this period. Finally, I'm just going to talk very briefly about alternative cultures, because obviously when we talk about the Bengal Renaissance, we naturally think about Bengali. And when we think about a lot of classical music, we think of Urdu. And I mean, certainly Bollywood doesn't help that. It kind of pushes forward the Urdu and the ghazal and all of this. I'm going to talk a little about Persian in Bengal, very, very briefly, because I think it's really interesting. Because it shows that debates about what Bengali music should sound like was actually part of a much larger conversation between artistic cultures. And each culture had its own language and its own priorities. So Persian from Mughal times had been the language of authority across North India. And it was only replaced by English as the official administrative language in 1837. And even then, actually, right across through the 19th century, you have poets working out of Calcutta who are doing all of their material in Persian. So it was very, very strong. And obviously, today we associate Persian with Muslim culture. But actually in India, because it had been so strong and so everywhere for hundreds of years, it very much had a culture of its own that was not exclusively Islamic. So you have lots of Hindu words like the Mahabharata being translated into Persian. You have Hindu families in Bengal who are writing their history in Persian. But what's interesting in my work is Persian did have a large bearing in Muslim sound art. So I'm not really talking about music here, I'm talking about the kinds of sounds that were developed and cultivated by religious cultures, particularly Muslim cultures. So I'm as part of my work, I won't get into now, but I'm looking at Shia communities in the 19th century. And obviously during Muharram, the Shias have a whole set of rituals and way to commemorate the events of Karbala. And within this was the majlis, which was kind of communal setting for it. And as part of this, marsias would be recited. And marsias were kind of lamenting poems, and they're really quite exquisite and beautiful. And so, and the way they were recited was developed over time, and there was a particular kind of training that you could have to be an expert at this. And Muslim courts paid for this training and paid for these rituals, and they built the imaras so that all of this could be performed. And one king I'm looking at was the last king of Lucknow, and he was no different. And when he came into Calcutta, he developed a huge culture of the marsiya that was based on Urdu and Persian, and he brought it with him into Calcutta. And what's interesting is when he was there, you already had Bengali forms of Persian and Urdu marsiyas. And as well as that, you also had a traditional form, which was always sung in Bengali and is still very prevalent in Muslim communities in rural areas, particularly in Bangladesh, called Jorigan. And so you have Jorigan, which has been brought in by the rural labourers into Calcutta, and so rural, lower class Shia groups will be singing in Bengali, or reciting rather, in Bengali during Muharram. And then you have the kind of upper classes in Calcutta who are performing Bengali texts, but written in Persian. And then you have all of these other people coming across from Lucknow, from Delhi, and they're all performing in Urdu and Persian as well. So actually you have these kind of three language systems all in the same performance space in this period of Calcutta, which I think in a nutshell it kind of sums up what's going on here. All of these languages, all these different issues, all of the meanings and cultural impact of choosing what you're singing or what you're performing. So, to go back to that initial quote when he said that Bengali music was a difficult thing to think about, and it was a heated topic. Why? First of all, different classes had their own favourites. You had traditional styles which were changing, but not everyone liked the direction that they were changing into. You had music that was related to morality and particular professions that were now being frowned upon, especially in connection with the public woman. You had old performance spaces which were also changing, and musicians forced to look for new employers and even new social identities. And yet music is a way of expressing a culture, but not all cultures were desirable anymore. And particularly in a period when the culture of urban Calcutta was becoming increasingly dominated by a middle class group who were Bengali speaking intellectuals but with an English education who had their own agenda for what was going on. And lastly, I'd just like to say that this confusion and this controversy actually set the scene for later innovators, which kind of who shaped how we see classical music today, who took hold of music and pushed it into a new direction. Figures like Banerjee, Inayat Khan, and of course the Tagores. Okay, let's see. If we open up for questions now, if anyone's got anything they'd like to ask. I mean, we're both quite early in our research at this stage, so but feel free to ask or comment on anything.
Just a very basic question. I was wondering, in Bengal, as you said, Priyanka, perhaps security country we always move on. You have this folk music, but as you said, with spiritually mystical religious dimension, especially in Salem district. I know in district like Shawn, it's quite popular. They have 1 or 2 people who are very famous. Baal Shongi. So I wonder, is Baal Shongi kind of continuation of what you've been describing historically? Do you think this has something to do with that?
It's been a long, continuing research on vowels separately. The problem is all these genres are overlapping. You cannot just pull out one strand and say that this doesn't have the influence of the other genre. So maybe their musical philosophies would sometimes differ or sometimes be similar. But Baal is not Kobigaan. They are more wandering bards. They have a very free access. They can wander about. They can sing. So Kobigaan is not it's not influencing Baal music as such. But they are all very religious in their content because they were coming from this rural religious environment. So they have similarities of structure, they might have similarities of content. But I mean, what we understand by Baal right now, today, in contemporary format, is not Kobigaan.
What's interesting is that wasn't one of the genres that really came trickling into Calcutta when all the other ones were. And it only really kind of came to the fore, I'd say, correct me if I'm wrong, it only really came to the fore in Calcuttan circles with Tagore, who kind of pushed it to prominence. But before then, it wasn't really on radar in Calcutta, it kind of stayed rural.
We're talking about are we combining music and like songs together? We're talking about both, or we're just talking about like the musical instruments versus the singers? We were more. I'm a bit kind of confused there a little bit. It's are we kind of really focusing on musicians or singers?
So with things like Kobigaan, like that song video, it was very much the emphasis on the singers because they're the ones who are coming up with witty question and answers, etc. With my groups, who are kind of the ones who used to work in the courts and then went off to all kinds of different places, with them, they were going through their own changes as well. So today, when you look at them, on the whole, you have families of singers and families of instrumentalists. So a lot of people are kind of like, well, I perform the sitar, I don't sing, that kind of thing. And actually, the families will marry into each other. And so you could have, say, my father was a sitar player, my grandfather was a sitar player, but he married a woman who is from a family of singers, that kind of stuff. And the families were kind of considered separately. But actually, I found part of what I'm doing is drawing up kind of family histories of all of these musicians in the 19th century. And there it was going back and forth. And actually, someone who was trained with an instrument would also be a very good singer and would perform both. And dancing, of course. Because now, when we think about classical singing and when we watch it in performance, like modern Indian classical singers, they're all seated, aren't they? But of course, when you watch the Bollywood films there, obviously there is the overlap. And I'm not saying the 19th century is like a Bollywood film, but what I would say is, particularly with the women, there was this big overlap between song and dance. always. And this was something that really changed in this period, because suddenly it wasn't acceptable for women to be dancing in public if they were respectable women. So all that's changing here as well. But no, I'd say that certain genres like Kobigaan were about singing, and then actually the classically trained performers could do everything. They could do instruments, they could do song.
What type of song were really popular at the time? Was it classical things?
Yeah.
Classical music?
So in classical music, it's interesting.
Pop, jazz, and whatever they had in their time.
The
with all the classifications of music.
You had kind of three classifications. You have classical, semi-classical, and then kind of popular music. So Kobigaan stuff can be drawn into the popular music category. But classical music, you'd have things like Drupad and Khayal, which is still very prominent today, obviously. But then in this period, in the 19th century, the semi-classical genre really came to the fore, and they're things like Tumri, Dadra, and Ghazal. Ghazal, usually sung in Persian or Urdu. Tumri and Dadra were particularly associated with the biggies and female performance, and they were usually written in an old dialect of Hindi called Brajbhasha. And they're still continuing to be sung in that language today. But they were all kind of sung by the same performers. But I mean, today the general rule is that Tumri and Dadras are kind of thought of as female song forms, and Drupad and Khayal are more masculine and have accents to it. But it's actually more confusing.
So was music ever used as a political tool to instigate or even sort of what's the word? Pressurize the revolution change?
The shawn performances were the songs that the shawn performance would include towards the early 20th century to mid 20th century. They were also part of the independence movement for India. So their content was also changing according to the nationalistic spirit that Bengal was going through. Sometimes there would be songs against the partition of Bengal. So yeah, I mean, what I was talking about the infusion of leftist sentiments into the song. So this was something that was happening towards the early 20th to mid 20th century. And one thing about this three classifications of classical, semi-classical, and popular, there was a musical genre called the akhara. Akhara is a place where you are trained in music. It's akhara in Hindi would mean a wrestling ground where the wrestlers are trained, but it could also mean a place where you are musically trained. So akhara was a genre which was prevalent, which was started by a person called Rani Bhigupto in Bengal. So one of his disciples, he suddenly felt that they were not gaining that much of attention or popularity with this very classical or semi-classical format of akhara. So why not include some Kobigaan elements in it? Okay. So he formed the half akhara. So it became a new genre that infuriated his guru, Rani Bhigupta. You cannot tamper with my creation, the akhara. You cannot bring in these elements into it. But then, in the process, half akhara gained more popularity than akhara. So within these genres, within this classifications, you could just take out or bring in forms according to the audience choice, audience taste. So that's how new genres they started becoming popular amongst the audience.
How frequent three types of music? How frequent was it advertised? Say pre-British rule in Calcutta, in terms of the Persian Urdu classical music, and in terms of popularity, was it the Byzantine? You were talking about
Washroom.
Washroom. Because that was obviously, I don't know how popular that magazine was and how they advertised all these things. And is it something that most people attended or most people read?
That's interesting.
That's a two-question there.
Well, first of all, yeah, obviously you have these newspapers that are coming out, they're all quite new as well. With the advertising, you know more about me, I would have thought. I mean, because the stuff that I'm looking at with the Urdu and Persian stuff that was going on. So first, mostly they were based in kind of private functions. So it would always be kind of, you know, a wealthy zamindar or someone living in town, and he'd throw on a private function to mark a festival. So if it was Dome Puja, then you have a big party in your house, you have huge grounds, you'd invite people to it. And so some of them were quite exclusive, and then others actually, all kinds of people were going along, and children were invited, and it was quite a big thing. And so with things like that, they were certainly talked about a lot in the newspapers afterwards. There were always reviews of them, and which is one of the ways we can tell what's actually going on in newspapers. We can read, you know, what people saw in the critics and stuff. So I think it was kind of a mixture of word of mouth, and people talking about it in the comment columns and stuff in the newspapers more than anything. And what's interesting is later those private functions in the private houses turned into some of the earliest theatres, because they said, well, you know, let's actually put up a stage, let's do it properly. And then from that, it then went into the proper professional stages, etc. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Was there any, in terms of, obviously, with Kobigaan, there was the issue of morality with the British family at that time. Yeah. Was there anything similar to that with the Persian Urdu festival?
Yes, in a sense, because, let me see, you can kind of look at it both ways. So, from the Bengali perspective, a lot of the people who were still paying for Persian and Urdu performances, etc., they were trying to say, these are all respectable things, something we can be proud of, this is a developed musical system. Because a lot of the colonial scholars who were out there were saying that Indian music is a bit like ancient Greek music. And they were saying ancient Greek music, of course, has changed. And, you know, we don't do ancient Greek music now. And whereas Indian music is very interesting and important for us to understand as a historical thing, but it's not really modern, it's not clever, they don't have melody, etc. All these arguments. So the Bengalis were saying, well, look, we're singing in Urdu and Persian, and it's beautiful and it's sophisticated. So that's from that side. The problem is from the British side, they'd built up this whole criticism of the Nawabs and the Rajas by saying they're not fit to govern because they spend their whole time listening to music. And that music is immoral as well. So all of this kind of built up. So the British were saying, well, we could listen to Urdu and Persian singing, but actually it's kind of this old kind of pathetic thing, which is why we have to take over the country, etc. It didn't mean that they stopped listening to it though, because it was beautiful, and so actually you do get a lot of British people continuing to listen to it and kind of thinking, oh, this is like the old regime before we changed it all, etc. So
there was a cultural effect of reporters.
Yeah.
About the newspapers, the kind of reports that I was going to show, they were mostly newspapers from that were patronized by the colonial officials. So advertisements would be more prominent when the theatre started gaining ground in the city. So there would be advertisements about performances, pantomime acts, farces. Interestingly, there's been very, very less documentation about Kobigaan. It was only in the 19th century, around 1850s, that there was this initiative by a person called Tagore, who suddenly felt that these Kobiwalas, or the poet performers, we should be reviving their life stories. So he began a newspaper called the Sambat Prabhakar. Because by the 19th century also sees clashes between different groups in the city, so which is called in Bangla Doladu. So there are different groups, they're fighting, they're voicing their fights within the newspaper. So he wanted to separate his newspaper from what was happening within the city. So he said, my paper would document the lives of these poet performers. And in all the publications, he is constantly saying that it's too painful to get material about their lives because they are lost. I have to travel like far distances to get material, but we need to revive this. So this was the revivalist strand of the gentlemen, the Hindu gentlemen, who wanted to revive this form, and that is the first, I would not say authentic, but that is the first initiative of documenting or writing about the Kobigaan through a newspaper, and that set the trend for the later historians or biographers who started writing about the Kobigaan performance.
I guess I wanted to know a bit more about the Hamlets itself and as to all the different forms of music, as to how easy were performers moving in and out of different forms of music. So someone who's performing Kobigaan, would they be going into shawn? And someone who's performing in shawn going into Kobigaan? Is there any such fusion there? And just because they seem somewhat similar in terms of the whole theatrical, the dramatic and spectacular sort of the form itself, and just because the music is somewhat subversive, the whole the Kobigaan itself, I'm wondering as to who the patrons were and to what extent they influenced the sort of content of the music itself, or was it singers who had more or less autonomy over the subject of the content of the music. So if you could just talk a bit more about that. And from Rich, I do have a question for you about the biggies themselves. And it's sort of respectability, and I'm wondering if, you mentioned someone who were Bengali. So, where did this whole being versed in Persian, where did it come from? What families were they? Who were the families? Where were they coming from? Is that just in terms of where they were coming from, is that the reason why they set themselves apart from the Kento bodies? Could that explain just in terms of where they were coming from, their backgrounds as students?
I'll go first, Shawn. Yeah. Okay. So with the Bengali biggies, so like I say, the biggie culture, if you will, the symbolic role of the biggie is someone who isn't Bengali but is North Indian, and the kind of if you were watching Dead Dust, then you'd expect to see one of that. Anyway, so that's not quite what you'd have in mind if you went to kind of a Bengali red light district in Calcutta, etc. So it was part of an identity creation in a way. And the way they did it was these Bengali women would go to the houses run by other Bengali women who had built up a pile of money and would then pay Muslim ustads, so male music teachers from North India, to teach them Urdu and Persian. And particularly getting the pronunciation perfect. And you often read accounts of kind of these Bengali women worrying that they're not pronouncing their cousins perfectly, because if they want the best patrons, those patrons have heard the best Persian cousin already, so you really have to match it. In terms of who they were, they could come from all kinds of different backgrounds, and the British often kind of, spun terrible things about them, and as did a lot of Bengali intellectuals and newspapers. But actually, when you look at the demographics, a lot of them are sort of women who have been abandoned or have been maltreated at home, or some kind of disaster has happened, and so they've all come into the city and they found a way of earning money and shelter by going into these houses. And interestingly, a lot of them were Kulin Brahmins who had either been widowed and therefore had found that it was easier to go into the city rather than remain at home. And at that point, a lot of them went into this profession. And so a lot of them actually had a very good education already, which is why they could pick up these kind of materials easily. And a lot of them were Kulin Brahmins who had never actually been married, because you hear that some of the families were so strict about exactly who could marry your daughter, that actually a lot of these daughters just never got married, and they were stranded at home and kind of, stuck in the corner and were being frowned upon by their family, had nothing to do. And so actually a good way out to make something of their lives was to go into the city and develop this new profession. But obviously, like I said, they had to at the same time deal with the fact that it wasn't considered a moral profession anymore. And so there are all of these issues going on.
But is that what set them apart from the...
Yeah, I think it could be. I think, to be honest, I think the main dividing factor was talent, really, because obviously if you had a good singing voice and you could learn music well, then you quickly rose up and you quickly learned these new repertoires and you quickly started performing, people noticed you and started paying for you to sing rather than to pay you to do an erotic dance. I think that was the main issue, really, but I think they were actually quite similar in terms of demographic.
I think he was next.
Do you want to answer the question?
He was next, yeah.
You can answer the question.
Very quickly. No, I mean, a Kobigaan performer would not be a shawn performer. So there was a kind of hierarchy in these performances themselves. The Kobigaan was a musical performance, where shawn was mostly, it was bodily acts, more theatrical. So they would also have these clay models built in this area of idol makers called kumortuli. So there would be processions. They would take them in a carriage with all those idols, and then they would show their own antics. So Kobigaan performer would not involve himself with it in such theatrical acts per se, but he could change his genre. I mean, he could become a Panchali singer. So Panchali is a different genre of music. Or else he could include Panchali songs within the Kobigaan repertoire itself. Because Kobigaan had a very flexible structure. You could just take in or take out whichever genre you felt that, I mean, it was also a performer's choice. If you felt that he would use it as a strong card within a performance, he could do that. And the second question about the patrons, I mean, this is something very interesting about the patron's taste or what kind of music he would like to listen. Rabindranath Tagore has used a very interesting phrase for these patrons of these Kobiwalas. He calls them as Hathak Raja, a sudden king. So he's not the king or patron who was there, I mean, he's suddenly become one with the public. He's not the patron or the king who had a royal court. He is one with the public now. So his taste, I mean, he could listen to Kobigaan performance, he could see Banerjee performances, and if he was an English educated Babu, he would later develop his taste or interest towards theatre. So it was also a very ambivalent position, I would say. I mean, it was nothing very concrete. I mean, it would not be that since I'm a patron of Kobigaan, I'm only supposed to listen to Kobigaan. So the taste would keep on varying. And one of the most prominent patrons of these performances was Babu Krishna Dev of Shobha Bazaar. The Shobha Bazaar Rajbari, which is still prevalent. It's still there in Calcutta. So he was one of the patrons. And then there would be the patrons of Priyanka, there would be patrons of Jurashapo, the Tagore family. So those are them.
Yeah, we've got time for another few questions, maybe 5 minutes, probably.
Yeah, just a very good question. It's all very interesting. I'm particularly interested in something in between what both of you are talking about in terms of the short question, I guess, was there a respectable way for a woman to get involved in this sort of higher musical respectability? My own comparison would be to Arabic music in Egypt, where there were women who came out of a Quranic reciting tradition, and as society changed and the liberation of women happened, and then there was pan-nationalism in the 1950s and 60s as part of the independence movements, then suddenly there were women who were actually coming from very traditional background who rose into respectability and became respectable in their own right, singing very secular and very love-oriented or nationalist sort of songs. But it seemed that those that came out of the sort of 10s and 20s and 30s had to have gone through that journey of being religious reciters first to get to that point of respectability. And I'm just wondering if you came across anything similar like that.
I have a very prominent example in mind, and she's very popular in Bengal as a theatre actress. Her name is Binodini, and she was a sex worker, and then she was taken. She got access to the stage, Bengali stage, and it was towards the end of her. Towards the later career on the stage, that she was made to act in a religious play, and that's when one of the religious leaders of Bengal, and his name is Krishna Paramhans, he came up. He was one of the audience, and he came up and he blessed him and said, that's in Bangla, Ma tomar chaitanya hok, let you be evolved. And that's how, what I want to say is that religion was seen, since a prostitute would not be suitable, so to say, for the stage. So religion was a kind of cover or a way for her self-fashioning to get access to the kind of narrow respectability that she would earn for herself. But I think, but that was not something, this is one example of Binodini. It would not have happened to not many women like her, because she was kind of patronized by one of the theatre stalwarts in the city. So examples like this are not numerous, this is just one.
We need to wrap up in a minute, but we'll just do these two quickly.
Okay, I'll just make it quick. First of all, it's a fascinating presentation, it's very informative, so thank you for that. Two things I really relate, though I'm from East, to some terms that are very derogatory. For example, the swear word called naughty, not naughty, it's in English, which actually means notoki, the one used to dance, and also baiji. When we were being brought up, we were familiar with those words in a negative way. So if someone is swearing, they like to swear. But this is just my observation from my own life. I've got one question for Priyanka. Is that I don't know if I missed the first bit of the presentation. If it was solely the presentation was based on Kobigaan. If it was not, then was there any role by Lalon? I believe he was probably in late early 19th century. Or is it that just you're focusing excluding Lalon? That's one of my questions to you. And my other question is the politicization, as you've mentioned it, gradually the transformation, how it was, Hinduized, and then there was a communist element, and later on how it became, Islamicized. And just quick two words. One is about probably for all the audience, bearing in mind the Mughal legacy, the legacy of Mughal, and where probably the Persian comes along, and also the bazaar, the idea of social capital, where actually it was advertised, and where ultimately, not necessarily it was always in an elite house. The word akhra, I remember when we were being brought up, we were told, like the boys are gathering up there, they have made this an akhra. I mean, this is a bad place, boys don't go there, stay at home. This is how, the connotations of the word has. So my question to you is, what happened to Lalon, and what is the politicization?
Lalon is not part of my research. If you want real solid information on what is happening with Lalon as research, I think you should look at Dr. Sudipta Chatterjee's work, Man of the Heart. The website is www.lalon.org. He's he's working in Kushtia and trying to revive the Lalon's legacy and continuity. I'm not including Lalon because I think he belonged to a different tradition. what I'm looking at in my research is very Calcutta specific performances. So if I extend my scope of research to Lalon, it's not possible to include everything in one research.
So before Tagore, within Kolkata?
Within Kolkata, and specifically Kobigaan, that's the title of my research, because I'm trying to locate where it went and how it is performed today. Because if I include Lalon, I would also have to take into account Baul and many such other performances, which cannot be tagged or grouped together.
No? Okay, I'll go on.
He's good. Yeah.
I just want to know, 18th century in Murshidabad or in other parts, the Shia community in Dhaka was in majority. The whole aristocratic community in Dhaka was Shia. What was happening in music today? Why did it permeate through Calcutta? Why? I mean, the high culture, that's all over the world. The synthesis of culture, I'm talking about the mixture. It cannot be a homogeneous, completely detached from the rest of it. It must be influenced by all these things. Shia, not only, the Sufi culture. Sufi permeates through Bengal all the time. Every music is shaped by Sufi culture. Persian language, Brahman himself was a scholar of Persian. The status of Persian language was enormous in Bengal. What are those significance in music, particularly in music? And what happened to this Shia community from Dhaka and Murshidabad? What kind of music they generated there? And why did it come through, through Bengal, Calcutta and other parts? I just want to know a little bit of that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, that's actually one of the things I'm trying to do in my work. I haven't got to it yet. But just to, I won't leave you with that. The Shia connection in particular, I think is fascinating.
And Sufi.
And Sufi, of course, because Sufi is
Bengal is completely enamored with Sufi.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was integral to kind of the Muslim presence in Bengal. These Sufi.
Yes, I know that, but particularly Sufi.
So,
and Persian.
well, of course, yeah. And in fact,